Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Krynki, where the Russian forces have yet again managed to advance further upon the Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnieper River. So we are seeing that the Ukrainians had this Krynki bridgehead for a very long time now, for a couple of months, where they managed to capture parts of the village of Krynki, the town of Krynki, here on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. However, they have since then had faced a stalemate due to the lack of supplies being able to travel across the Dnieper River, and also due to Russian resistance in this area, where they constantly launch small-scale counterattacks with armored vehicles or infantry assault groups. And in the most recent one of those, the Russians managed to capture parts of the forest here to the southeast of the Ukrainian positions and have managed to advance further within the town itself. So we're seeing continuous Russian advances over the past few weeks and months through the Ukrainian Krynki bridgehead, where the Ukrainians have essentially a large amount of soldiers across the Dnieper River to attain this bridgehead across. However, they have not managed to achieve anything with it. Despite Western experts claiming that this is the start of a Ukrainian offensive across the Dnieper River, I've always said in my own analysis that the Ukrainians would never be able to launch an offensive across the Dnieper River as the situation was back then and as the situation is now. In my previous analysis, I claimed that the Ukrainians would not be able to launch an offensive across the Dnieper River due to the width of the river line, as well as the fact that they have to establish proper supply lines across the Dnieper River. This is very difficult to attain because the Ukrainians do not have a navy. Instead, what they have are speedboats to throw across the river line, send reinforcements and supplies through those, which is extremely difficult. So they would need to establish either pontoon bridges or reconstruct the Antonovsky Bridge, which they themselves have destroyed, to actually cross over the Dnieper River. So a physical standing bridge. However, that is also very difficult because just as the Ukrainians destroyed the Antonovsky Bridge multiple times while the Russians were across the Dnieper River, the Russians could do the same. And as we saw, it ended with a Russian withdrawal across the Dnieper River due to this constant shooting of the supply lines across the Dnieper River. So a Ukrainian assault across the Dnieper River would just end up in the same manner. So them consistently and constantly launching assaults across the Dnieper River ends up being just insanity, because in the end they would never be able to achieve a proper bridgehead. The best that they have managed to do over, about a year now, since it's been over a year since the Ukrainians recaptured all of Kherson city and the surrounding areas across the Dnieper River, is this small area by Krynki. It was initially a bit larger, going and stemming from a couple more buildings and areas here within the town of Krynki. However, they never really got anything significant to actually establish proper positions. Instead, they held this small area by Krynki. However, what was surprising to me was the fact that they were able to hold it onto it for so long. However, at the same time, we also see that despite them holding it onto it for so long, the amount of infantry they lose holding onto it is very significant. Even if the Ukrainians ended up destroying tens of tanks and other armored vehicles of the Russian armed forces trying to recapture this Krynki area, the Ukrainians would, over the span of the months that they have held this area, send hundreds of soldiers across. And if the area has not expanded, that means that these soldiers are holding onto this small area. This shows how difficult it is for the Ukrainians to push through the Russian defenses in the area, and also how difficult it is to establish a proper foothold across the Dnieper River. And as such, we are seeing the very sad development for the Ukrainian armed forces, that they would have lost hundreds of soldiers, if not thousands, trying to establish this bridgehead across the Dnieper River. Yet it is now at the verge of ending, as Russians, with these slow advances, slowly are putting an end to the Ukrainian bridgehead across for no gain. And you can't even claim for it to be some sort of distraction, because in the end the Russians have a significant surplus of both artillery and infantry and other armored vehicles, allowing the Russians to simply send a few this way and deal with the Ukrainians launching assaults across the Dnieper River. It would not even surprise me if this was simply an operation by the Russians to drain down and create another meat grinder for the Ukrainian forces, because in the end it is a hopeless operation, and why the Ukrainians continued it for this long surprises me. And in the end, if the Russians manage to recapture this area, the months of fighting and the hundreds of soldiers lost for the Ukrainians would amount to no success and no purpose whatsoever. We then move further north in the direction of Hryhorivka, here to the northwest of Marinka, where the Russians have managed to make a slight advance with some infantry assault groups. The Russian forces here, due to this geolocated footage, shows that they have managed to capture the buildings here to the west of the church, and as such there's a continuously developing small-scale offensive by the Russians here to the west of Marinka, establishing positions here in the less concentrated areas of Hryhorivka. We see that there's a clear difference between the main parts of the town and the smaller parts here to the east of it, and as such these will be easier for the Russians to just storm through, while further westwards you'd have to use and expend much more artillery, which we're already seeing with further geolocated footage showing constant bombardments in the central parts of Hryhorivka. We then move on to Pervomayske, here to the northwest of Donetsk itself, where we're seeing some in-depth artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions as the Russians continue doing this positional fighting in the area. So we're seeing more and more further in-depth strikes of the Russian forces compared to previously, where we saw much more at the front line. This shows that the Russians are now focusing more on a backline focus of targeting compared to frontline. This indicates that the Ukrainian forces at the front are now in position where their fortifications are much weaker, and the new strategy of the Ukrainians using these small assault groups, which by now is not a new strategy anymore, but it has differed from the start of the war. With these smaller assault groups, the larger concentration of forces are in the back line. Therefore, we'll likely see much more strikes by both sides on the back line compared to the front line, due to the expenditure of artillery needs to be more efficient and doesn't have to be on smaller groups but on larger groups. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where we here see Russian artillery and Lancet strikes on Ukrainian air defense systems that are more small range ones closer to the front line. So this one here shows that the Russians are also hitting all of these different types rather than just tank and firing positions, but also artillery and anti-air defense systems throughout the front. Moving a bit further north to the Kupiansk direction, we see here a Russian Lancet drone strike on Ukrainian artillery systems over the northwest of Kupiansk. So we're seeing constant attacks by the Russian drones as well by the front line. And again, these are more in-depth rather than front line. So instead of launching artillery and Lancet drones on infantry, we are then seeing the Russians using it on more in-depth targets. Something that also contributes to this change in strategy and focus of the artillery is the increased usage of FPV drones. So the Russians just use FPV drones instead of artillery on frontline soldiers, and the same with the Ukrainians. They're also using more FPV drones rather than artillery on frontline soldiers. So artillery is now more focused on higher value targets. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.